start with, this event has come together in such a short time, and I'm really happy with how many people have come out to join us today. I'm really fortunate enough that my job is basically just to stand up here and chat for a few minutes, but I want to give the big thank you to those who did the real work of getting this event organized. I want to give a big thank you to Daniel Benish, Kaylin Christensen, and Wendy Ginigal for being the main organizers of the event. And I also want to thank Bianca Hutton for calling on her connections with the university and arranging an amazing speaker we have after the film. And speaking of which, I want to give a really big thank you to Dr. Finlay. She's going to be not only giving a great talk after the film, but answering any sort of biology-related questions that have come up that you guys are curious about after watching the film. And trust me when I say no one wanted me to be the one trying to field those questions. I also want to give a thank you to Mayor Fougere and Amber Peters, who is our contact at the Mayor's office, for proclaiming February 12th as Darwin Day in Regina. I think it says a lot that this request was never treated as controversial, and we are really happy with the response that we got from the Mayor's office. I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank the International Darwin Day Foundation and the National CFI organization. Dr. Finlay may have to have me expelled for plagiarism if I didn't credit them with providing many of my later comments when it comes to explaining what the heck we're all doing here today. A well-deserved thank you is also owed to Shay Aaron for her work on making the beautiful posters to advertise the event. And I also want to thank Terry Chadwick for his work in sort of taking care of the technical side of things and getting the room organized. Last but not least, I certainly want to thank Kendra Getty and the Saskatoon CFI, which we'll send our thank yous that way, for lending us the film we're going to see. They have not just purchased the DVD itself, but also the rights to show it publicly, which was no small cost for them, and we really appreciate them allowing us to share. I probably missed some people, and it's in no way because their work isn't appreciated, mainly just because since having kids, my memory has gone from a steel trap to a steel trap made of wire mesh. So, part of why I'm here is to talk about what is Darwin Day, talk a little bit about natural selection. Like I said, we have an expert coming up after the film who's considerably more educated than I am, who will be explaining things much better than I could. But I'll give a small intro, and I'll also be talking a little bit about the film we're about to see. In addition to that, though, I wanted to give a brief explanation about what is the CFI, the Center for Inquiry. A lot of explanations I'll give were lifted directly off the CFI's national website, and I encourage anyone interested in finding out more to check it out. We printed off a couple of pieces of paper that have the info on it that you can pick up on your way out. Now, the Center for Inquiry is an educational charity, and yes, it is registered, so if any of you want to give a donation and it's more than $10, we can get your information and make sure you get a tax receipt. But it's an educational charity with a legal mandate to educate in the application of secular, skeptical, rational, and humanistic inquiry, and to develop communities where like-minded individuals can meet and share their experiences. Nationally, it focuses on three sort of broad areas. Number one, religion, ethics, and society. Number two, pseudoscience, paranormal, and fringe science claims. And number three, medicine and health. Locally, we've had similar focus, but until very recently, and by recently I essentially mean today, we've been mainly focused on the community building aspect, more than the educational outreach part of things. That's mainly because the group in Regina is still quite new, and it's only recently that we've reached the critical mass necessary to put on events like today. Up until this point, we've done some barbecues, had some pub nights, and other social gatherings, mainly just to get a better chance to know each other and who each other are. Going forward, though, we certainly are hoping to have more events just like today. The Canadian Centre for Inquiry, Centre spelled with an R-E, is an affiliate of the Transnational Centre for Inquiry, spelled with an E-R. Internationally, the CFI is a massive organization with multiple publications, libraries, scholarship programs, and symposia around the world. They even offer undergraduate degree programs and partner with universities in the United States to offer postgraduate degrees. One of the main goals of the CFI, locally, nationally, and internationally, is to advance critical thinking, scientific literacy, secular humanism, and freedom of thought. Now, promoting secularism is often a worrisome phrase for some people. It's important to note that while aiming to foster a secular society, we're not seeking to abridge the rights of believers, and while we vigorously object to government support of religion and the use of religious dogma to justify public policy, we don't oppose the free exercise of religion. Nationally, we operate through around a dozen branches throughout Canada and tireless efforts, literally hundreds of volunteers. Locally, our group has about 50 to 100 members, with about 15 to 20 people sort of being really active. We would love to have more people join us, or even just check us out. And the best way of doing that would be to either send us an email or come join our group on Facebook. Again, we're going to have little sheets of paper that have that basic information on them. Our members certainly come from a wide variety of backgrounds. We have some people who grew up in completely non-religious households. We have those who grew up in households that were marginally religious, sort of going to church on Christmas and Easter, and that's about it. And then we have some people like myself who at one point in their lives were very religious. We've got bankers and biologists, small business owners and students, artists, computer scientists, and religious scholars. It's interesting that while there certainly is an underlying political element to the idea of secularism, CFI definitely has people from throughout the traditional sort of left-right political spectrum. Being an atheist also certainly is not a requirement for joining the CFI. We have some members who still self-identify as Christian or Muslim or other religious beliefs. But we do ask that those who are religious but still interested in our ideals just respect the fact that the group provides a place for those of us who are non-religious to gather in a place without judgment. Now, when I say without judgment, I certainly don't mean without debate. So be prepared if you come out to one of our pub nights, you will be in for a night of sometimes heated discussions over issues that will often come completely out of left field. So I get to summarize about the CFI. The organization's aims are broadly twofold. First, we look to provide a community and a voice for those of the sort of minority non-religious worldviews, including atheists, agnostics, and secular humanists. Secondly, to advance a social and political agenda promoting evidence-based decision-making, fundamental freedoms, and church and state separation. So, why are we celebrating Darwin Day? Well, celebrations are an important part of every culture. They provide a tradition and a common bond to be shared amongst those who make up that culture. They permit us to experience a meaningful connection to one another and to the principles that we hold in common. At this point in history, the world has become so small and interdependent, many of us feel that we need global celebrations to promote a common bond among all people. The Darwin Day celebration was founded on the premise that science, like music, is an international language that speaks to all people in very similar ways. While music is both intellectual and entertaining, science is our most reliable source and knowledge system, and it has been and continues to be acquired through human curiosity and ingenuity. Moreover, evolution via genetic variation and natural selection, introduced by Darwin and expanded on by many others over the years since, has become the central organizing principle in all of biology. According to Ernst Mayr, a very accomplished and acclaimed biologist, to study biology while neglecting evolution would be like studying physics without Newton's laws that govern the universe, or chemistry without the periodic table. Clearly, Darwin himself has become an internationally acclaimed figure whose influence on progressive modern thought continues to be both profound and pervasive. Current research in the field of genetics, including that on the human genome, has conclusively shown that all humans are essentially identical, and that we are genetically related to all other living things on the planet. So, an enlightened view of genetics is one of unity and equality among all humans, and also that fosters a deeper sense of respect and appreciation for all life. Today, the validity of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection rests in our understanding of the molecular mechanisms of genetics. So, from that, we conclude that Charles Darwin definitely is a worthy symbol on which to focus in order to build a global celebration of science and humanity that is intended to promote a common bond among everyone. So, I'm going to touch again briefly on natural selection itself. A common misconception is that Darwin discovered evolution. In fact, the idea of evolution had already been around for quite a while, but what wasn't understood or was misunderstood was the how. What Darwin did was give us an answer to that question with the theory of natural selection. Now again, I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of natural selection. I'm going to let the NOVA film and Dr. Finlay take some care of that side of things. But I do want to talk a bit about what natural selection isn't and why I think the theory has been viewed as controversial by some. Now this is my copy of The Origin of Species. And while I've read it, it's not a book that I go back to in my daily life very often. However, this is another nice thick book from my home that has a much more profound effect on my daily life. It's a beautifully written book that draws on multiple sources and multiple authors. Many times I don't follow its instructions word for word, but I use it as an inspiration to make my life better as well as the lives of my family and friends. Probably read passages from this book at least 2 to 3 times per week, and on days like Christmas and Thanksgiving, I'm not sure if I can make it through the day without it. Some of you may have guessed this is, of course, the joy of cooking. So, what do these 2 books have in common? I didn't just bring it up to make a bit of a guess. Well, while both are very, very important, one to the world and one to me, they're both meant to be used within a limited scope. Natural selection does not explain how life itself initially started, doesn't explain the origins of the universe, and it does not inherently give direction on living a moral life. That's not to say that understanding natural selection doesn't give insight into those things, but doing so was never its primary intent. Just like when my ice cream recipe gives me a better understanding of chemistry, that's great and all, but not the measure by which I judge the book it comes from. So I said that I would touch on why this whole natural selection thing is so controversial to some people. Personally, I think it's because the idea comes along and replaces part of, a fairly small part of actually, but a part of nonetheless, a book that was supposed to give all answers. A common element in most religious texts, whether the Christian Bible and the Society Charles Darwin himself came from, or many of the others throughout the world. The common element is an attempt to give answers to the origin of things, but also to give direction on how to live in the here and now. By invoking the infallibility of the Bible or any other holy book, any challenge to a part of it feels like it is challenging the whole. This leaves a large gap to fill, as the book that replaces the creation story with evolution doesn't also fill those other gaps that were previously filled by the rest of the religious text. Now, that's not to say there aren't some other secular or skeptical tools that can still step in to fill that gap. But for someone looking for a single book for all answers, this new way of doing things just doesn't work. The amazing thing about science, though, is that's okay. It's also perfectly okay for us to say that both of these books have flaws. They are incomplete even within their own area of expertise. Darwin himself said at the introduction to The Origin of Species, "This abstract, which I now publish, must necessarily be imperfect." Big contrast to what came before it. So whether it's coming up with a brand new way to cook a chicken or mapping the human genome, we are constantly refining and even coming up with completely new recipes. It's the lessons that we learn from these books, though, that enable us to do that. It's the lessons we take from the book that let us come up with those new recipes. The key thing to remember is that above and beyond the specific discoveries, it is the way of doing things that these books teach us that's important. Darwin's contribution to science isn't just the most profound organizing principle in all of biology, and I do feel weird saying just there, but it is also a symbol for the dedication to a methodology that reminds us not to start with a conclusion, but to start with evidence. It reminds us to not start with why am I right, but to start with why could I be wrong? And that brings us to today's film. 150 years is a long time, and it's been even more than that since the publication of The Origin of Species. In spite of countless attempts throughout the years, the general organizing principle of natural selection has stood the test of time. Specific elements, though, within it have been altered, adapted, and built upon. This film explores not just what Darwin learned within his own time, but also some of the amazing discoveries that have happened since. While watching the film, I want to put out a challenge to the room. When watching the film, try and think of reasons why something you currently believe is wrong. I know some of my friends may be nodding to themselves, knowing that I'm talking to the creationists out there who have come to watch. And I am. But I'm also talking to those who aren't. The great thing about science is it's not blasphemy to try and think about why even natural selection itself is wrong. I don't think you're going to find that answer, because I don't think it's there, but I think looking for it is fantastic. But on a smaller scale, I also challenge you in your mind not just to challenge the assertions you hear within the film or the talk or walk into this day already knowing, but also challenge the ones that you firmly believe. Challenge the assertions that you agree with in the film. Don't just challenge the ones you look at and in your gut go, I don't know. Because to me, there's no better way than that to celebrate the spirit of Darwin Day. So that's all I have for right now. We do have Stephanie from the biology department that's going to talk about another sort of Darwin Day event that's coming up in the next little while, and then we'll get started on film.
I'm going to keep this really brief because I know you guys want to get to the movie. But basically, if this is just not enough Darwin for you guys, we're having another Darwin Day event on Tuesday, the 12th, actual Darwin Day, from 2:30 to 5 in CK 185, so that's the Center for Kinesiology by the gym. We're going to have cake, we're going to play Planet Earth movies, more popcorn, lots of games, and so hope that some of you guys are able to come out to that. And it's put on by BUGS, the Biology Undergraduate and Graduate Society, as well as the Faculty of Science.
I would like to introduce to everyone Dr. Kerri Finlay. She's been a professor here with the University of Regina. She's in her fourth year. She received her undergraduate
developed this classification system. So this is a classification system that we still use today within biology to describe organisms and how they're related to one another. So this idea of having domains in the kingdoms, and so on down to the species. Okay, so we had this nested classification system. So again, we still use this classification system today, but Linnaeus was still assuming or describing organisms that he believed never changed. Okay, that this was how God had created the organisms, but there was no evolution occurring. So this pattern was based on creation, not on evolution. Okay. There's some additional information coming from different disciplines. Cuvier, 1769 to 1832, he was a paleontologist. Okay, so he was looking at strata in rocks. And so you see in this photograph here, you can see the different strata within the rocks. And so what Cuvier was doing was that he could go back into deeper strata, which he knew were older, representing that general area for many years past. And when he looked at the fossils there, he realized that the fossils that were further down in this strata were less similar to what was present in that area at that time. Okay, so he saw that there were changes. He saw that organisms were different in history than what were there presently. However, he couldn't explain this, and how he attempted to sort of explain this away is using this theory of catastrophism, the idea that the mechanisms in the past are not the same as those in the present. So he pretty much just said things were different back then. Okay, something else was going on. What's going on today had nothing to do with all the processes, geological, climatological, biological. Things were just different back then. Okay, and that explained why the fossils were different. And this contrasted with Lyell. Okay, he was a geologist, and he decided pretty much exactly the opposite. So realizing that things that we observe today, processes that we can observe today, can actually be used to explain previous patterns historically. And so the classic example here is of the Grand Canyon. Okay, so the Grand Canyon, although formidable and absolutely beautiful, can be explained simply through erosion and what we know about erosion. Okay, so you can see we have a little stream at the bottom of the Grand Canyon here, and that is still continuing to eat away at the rocks and to take part of the rock away and carve it out even more. Okay, so it was entirely possible that something like the Grand Canyon could be explained through erosional processes that we understand are occurring today. The problem is we need a lot more time for it to occur. Okay, so this was the idea of uniformitarianism, so mechanisms of change are constant over time. And then finally we get to Lamarck, okay, who, coming back to biology, Lamarck was noticing again that the differences in organisms, okay, and how they varied from place to place. And he was the first to propose a mechanism for evolution. And we know now that it's wrong, right? So Lamarck's hypothesis was the idea of use and disuse. And the classic example here is of the giraffe. So he suggested that a giraffe that needed to reach up to get the leaves on the trees would stretch its neck, it would get longer, and therefore that longer neck would be passed on to its offspring, which would have a longer neck, and so on. Okay? So his idea was this theory of, or hypothesis of use and disuse. So if you use it, it gets bigger, and then those inherited, or those acquired characteristics within the life span would be inherited by the offspring. Okay? And he believed that this was an innate drive for organisms to become more complex. So every organism just wanted to become more complex innately. Okay? And so, like I said, we know that this is wrong now. It has been proven to be false many times over, but you have to give him credit for actually proposing some sort of mechanism for the differences among organisms. Okay? So, that's sort of setting the stage of different thoughts that were out there, okay, different relevant background research that Darwin was quite aware of. So I said at the beginning that Darwin was a very good scientist. And so if you start to think about the qualities of what makes a good scientist, again, these are fairly tangible things, okay, different aspects. So things like the ability to take thorough observations. Okay, Darwin obviously definitely noticing what was going on. He was paying attention to all the curious, just this simple love of nature. He was curious to know what was going on. He just had this drive to find out the answers. I will say he was patient. Some of the experiments, some of the papers and books that he wrote definitely required some patience to just slog through some things that some of us might not have kept up with. A keen eye. Again, just in terms of these observations, he noticed these things, he picked up on it, he would see it and he'd record it. Careful experimentation. Okay, if he did experiments, he took good notes. They were well planned out. And they addressed the questions that he was trying to ask. Methodical note-taking, again, just taking good observations of what was going on. And again, if you think about, I'll talk a little bit about the trip through the Galapagos, but he went to so many different places. If he didn't have a good series of notes afterwards to work with, it would have been pretty difficult to piece things back together. And I have to be a little bit, I don't mean to be cynical here, but I have to be a little bit honest as well, that beyond all of that, so all of the other components here, okay, anybody can have this. I mean, I think a lot of people that you know probably have all of these qualities, which really does make a good scientist. He had money though, okay? It does take money to do this. And again, as we get into some of the details of his path, you know, you'll recognize that he had the luxury to do these things. Somebody else with the exact same qualities and curiosity and so forth, if they didn't have the flexibility to go off on the Galapagos trip or on the Beagle, then they just simply would not have had that opportunity if they didn't have the money to do it. Okay? So on top of that, so he had all these qualities, and then he also employed the scientific method. And just as a review of the scientific method and the process that we go through, the first step is always observing and describing. And again, I think this is something that sometimes we lose these days. We're in a bit of a rush to get to the answer, and we assume that things have been described already. But just to go out, especially if we're talking about biology, ecology, to go out into that natural environment and just sit and observe things for a little while and see what's going on. Okay? Actually notice these small changes that are occurring. From those observations, you pose a question. The question leads to the development of hypotheses and predictions. And then you test the hypothesis using experiments or some other methods. And then you either falsify or you can support your hypothesis. We never prove hypotheses in science. We can only falsify them or support them. So from there, if these experiments start to support the hypothesis, then you just go back and you do more of them. So this need to iterate. So keep going back, developing more hypotheses, developing more experiments in order to test it. So how did Darwin himself actually do this in terms of observations? He had this 5-year voyage on the Beagle, okay, and that's just a map of where he went. And obviously the most influential area for him was the Galapagos Islands. Okay, so lots of different organisms that he had seen there. And so some of the observations that he noted there, very generally, noticing that variability in nature. Okay? And again, the video did a nice job of explaining that and some of those observations that he had found. But ultimately noticing that individuals of the same species vary considerably from one to the other. An example specifically from Darwin was his observation of barnacles. Okay, he spent a lot of time, and this is where the patience, I think, comes in, documenting and describing barnacle species. So he was really interested in the barnacles and what makes one barnacle species different from another barnacle species. And it required a lot of diagrams and just following the morphology, the shape of the shells, and so forth. Okay? And so you can see the attention to detail here, the observations that he's making here, and this started to contribute to his body of knowledge. Okay? Observations, again, the finches. Okay? So he noticed not only was there variability, but he also noticed that there seemed to be a fit between that variation and the environment that they were in. So the beaks seemed to match the diet that they were consuming. So from there, developing the question, going through that scientific method. Okay, so more specifically in this case, what caused the diversification of finches in the Galapagos noted that the power of the population is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. And so what he was noticing, he was describing the plight of man, okay, in that humans can grow very, very quickly, we can reproduce very quickly, but the earth does not have the power to support us, okay? If the number of individual humans keep increasing, we can't feed everybody. So he was describing this plight of humans in that there's going to be a lot of human suffering because we don't have enough resources to support all the people. But Darwin saw this and saw that this was true for pretty much every other organism on the planet. And so Darwin attempted to do some math. And in this case, he decided to look at the elephant. So he wanted to estimate how big the elephant population size could get if left unchecked. If you just let 2 individual elephants reproduce, what happens to their numbers? And so On the Origin of the Species, he says the elephant breeds when 30 years old and goes on breeding until 90 years old, bringing forth 3 pair of young in this interval. If this be so, at the end of the 5th century, there would be alive 15 million elephants descended from the first pair. People have tried to recreate his math, and it didn't go so well. Apparently, math wasn't his strong suit. People have tried multiple different ways. But the point's still there, right? Regardless of how accurate that exact number is, the point is there that if organisms are allowed to grow indefinitely, they're going to reach huge numbers. And I thought it was interesting how he used the elephant as an example. It's easy to see small, you can talk about rabbits breeding, and we know that they breed really quickly and that they can very quickly get out of control. But he went to the extreme, slow, long-lived animals here. Looking at elephants takes a long time for them to start to reproduce. Okay. But he showed that even these, given a little bit of time, could start to take over. And so he realized that there was this conflict, okay, for resources. So there is going to be this struggle to survive. So he pieced all this together and developed his hypotheses, predictions, okay? And to state it fairly clearly here, he's ultimately saying that with that variation in individual characters, we know that these characters are inherited from parents to the offspring, and that beneficial characteristics will increase the number of offspring that are being produced. So organisms that are better suited to their environment will do better in terms of producing more offspring. Secondly, that individuals reproduce unequally. Okay, so not all organisms or individuals are reproducing the same number of offspring, and therefore those organisms with the traits that make them better suited to the environment, they're going to produce more offspring, and therefore we see those traits accumulating in the population. Okay. So that's just a statement of essentially the hypothesis behind evolution by natural selection. Okay. So this was the hypothesis, and then from here, Darwin started to amass a lot of different evidence to support it. Okay, so artificial selection, in the movie they were talking about dog breeds, a couple of different examples here as well. So this is looking at the brassica plant. Okay, so on the left, this is the wild brassica plant. All of the vegetables on the right-hand side are all derived from the brassica plant. So depending on how you allow that plant to breed, which factors, which characters you're interested in, you will get very different vegetables ultimately forming. So if you select for the roots to grow bigger, then you'll get some of the root vegetables that are up there. If it's the leaves, then you'll get into the cabbages and the kale and this type of thing. Okay, so it's really obvious how big a change just allowing certain individuals to reproduce can have on the morphology of the population that follows. Continuing along, so this is called artificial selection because it's humans that are inducing the pressure here. Darwin was very interested in pigeons. Apparently, fancy pigeons is a thing in England, more so back in Darwin's day, where people like to collect and raise these pigeons of very different shapes. Okay, so Darwin was definitely doing this, and he was very aware of this, keeping different pigeons and allowing different ones with certain traits that he was interested in. If you let those ones reproduce, then you can continue to change the morphology, change the shape of the pigeons that are around. And the really cool thing is that as I Darwin knew that you could just select the ones with the characters that you were interested in and then exaggerate the traits in future generations. But now researchers have gone back again to the genes to figure out what exactly has gone on. And so just some dramatic photos here of the different types of pigeons. These are all derived from the pigeon that's probably waking you up at 5 o'clock in the morning outside your window, right? They do share an ancestor, okay? And so these researchers, not worrying about the details, but ultimately they've mapped out all of these different breeds of pigeons and have actually started to identify the genes that are responsible for the changes in the body shape. So Darwin, again, studying many different things. He was also interested in orchids, so certain other questions came up, this iterative process of going back and starting again with a different organism in this case. So orchids, again, at the time, people looked at orchids and said these are stunningly beautiful flowers. How could they possibly have any other purpose than to please us as humans, right? They're just attractive to look at, and that must be why they're here. But Darwin started to investigate that a little bit more and realized that it was the fertilization process. So the insects that were fertilizing the orchids were fairly closely matched. So the orchids were meant or designed, they evolved into these shapes in order to attract their pollinators and to attract the very specific pollinators. Okay. So he could actually explain these elaborate shapes within the orchids just based on fertilization and this need to reproduce, so biological explanation. As Darwin started to get older and he became more sick, he couldn't get out quite as much, and so he started setting up experiments around his sick bed, and he didn't quit, he just kept going. He still loved this and kept coming up with new experiments. And so he also started to look into movement of plants, so how plants actually start to move as they're growing, how they're moving towards a light source. And he plotted out what this picture on the right is showing, is how he plotted out from one time period to another over a matter of a couple of hours where the tip of the shoot was growing. So he was following that movement in order to explain again how the plants are responding to light and that evolutionary adaptation to light. Okay. So that's just a few different examples taken from different organisms and so forth that Darwin pulled together, which helped him develop that hypothesis, which became the theory. So again, what's interesting is that Darwin first developed the theory in 1838, but he didn't publish on the origin of species until 1859. Okay, so that's like 21 years that he was sitting on this. And so there's been lots of talk about what was going on in those 21 years. And yes, he was definitely amassing more information, okay, going through that iterative process and collecting more data that would support it. But he was also quite scared, okay, he was worried about what it meant, and he understood some of the implications there. Yeah. And then, so he started to piece all this together, and it was there, but he was sort of holding off from actually publishing it in the first place. And it wasn't until he received the document from Alfred Russel Wallace that pretty much outlined the same theory. And I think this also adds to the human side of Darwin, okay, that there was that doubt in there, and then there was that sense of panic as well. I think if people did that today, it's not considered to be the most academically honest approach to wait until someone sends you the same thing and rush to publish your own. But we've forgiven him. Wallace did. And so just to emphasize that it was the research that he did, barnacles, he was studying orchids, he was studying pigeons, geese, he knew about geology, he was reading about the human population, all of this different information across a wide variety of different disciplines and organisms. He also, collecting data from very different areas around the world. People were sending him stuff from all like